Miss Marple and the Mysterious House of Mirrors. Welcome once more to Cafe Tales. My name is Ailey, and I'm so happy you've joined us for another cozy evening together. I'd love to know where you are listening from and how's the weather in your part of the world. Share it in the comments and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our daily mysteries. Now let's get started. Chapter 1. Mirrors on the Green. The late summer afternoon hung heavy over St. Mary Mead, that peculiar thickness of air that comes in August when the sun has beaten down upon English soil for too many weeks, and even the most stolid flowers in cottage gardens begin to droop their heads in supplication for rain. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed chair by the window of her neat little house, set down her teacup with a small, precise click against the saucer. Her keen blue eyes, somewhat faded now with the passage of years but no less observant for all that, were fixed upon the village green, where an unusual sight had presented itself that very morning. Where ordinarily one might expect to see nothing more remarkable than the duck pond, and perhaps old Mr. Peggotty taking his constitutional, there now stood a veritable explosion of color and commerce. A traveling fair had arrived in the night, as such things often do. And by dawn the green had been transformed into a scene that would not have been out of place in some continental bazaar. Striped awnings fluttered in what little breeze there was. The scent of roasting chestnuts and something sweeter, perhaps toffee or candy floss, drifted through the open window. And there, dominating the center of it all like some gaudy palace, stood a painted wagon of considerable size, upon which large letters proclaimed Sears Wonder Pavilion, Hall of Mirrors and Ghosts. Most peculiar, murmured Miss Marple to herself. Though there was no one present to hear her, she reached for her knitting, a soft gray wool that was destined to become a bed jacket for her great niece. But her fingers moved automatically while her attention remained fixed upon the green. The doorbell rang with its familiar trill, and presently her faithful companion Cherry showed in Lady Bantry. "Jane," exclaimed Dolly Bantry, her pleasant, rather weathered face alight with curiosity. "You've seen it, I suppose. The most extraordinary thing? Arthur is quite beside himself. Says it's an outrage that they should be allowed to set up without proper permission from the council. But I think it looks rather fun. I haven't been to a proper fair since I was a girl." "Do sit down, Dolly, dear," said Miss Marple, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Cherry has just brought fresh tea. I confess I've been watching the preparations with some interest myself." Lady Bantry settled herself with a comfortable ease of long friendship. Mrs. Stoutley is in an absolute state about it. You know how she is about the Improvement Society and keeping St. Mary Mead respectable. She was holding forth at the post office this morning about the unsavory element that such entertainments attract. "Mrs. Stoutley," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, pouring tea with a steady hand, "is a woman of very decided opinions." "That's putting it kindly," said Lady Bantry with a chuckle. "Handsome woman, though. That sort of cool, composed beauty that makes one feel quite disheveled by comparison. Always so perfectly turned out, even for village occasions. Those pale gray gloves she wears and that lovely lace parasol." Miss Marple made a small non-committal sound and passed the teacup. Through the window, activity on the green had intensified. A small crowd was beginning to gather as the afternoon drew on towards evening, and the working folk of the village finished their daily tasks. "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that we might take a small walk after tea, just to see what all the fuss is about. Fresh air, you know, is so beneficial." Lady Bantry's eyes sparkled. "Jane Marple, you're as curious as a cat. Very well, I'm game if you are." And so it was that some 40 minutes later the two ladies found themselves approaching the cluster of stalls and entertainments that had sprung up around Sears Wonder Pavilion. The evening was drawing in, lending a softer quality to the light, and already paraffin lamps were being lit, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A man stood before the painted wagon, and Miss Marple observed him with the same careful attention she might give to a new species of bird in her garden. He was perhaps 55, with a shabby genteel appearance of one who has known better days, but maintains his dignity nonetheless. His suit, though well-brushed, had seen many seasons, and his voice, as he called out to the gathering crowd, held the practiced smoothness of the showman. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, step right up to Sears' Wonder Pavilion. A clean family amusement, I assure you. No trickery, no vulgarity, just the marvel of modern optical science combined with a touch, just a touch, mind you, of the supernatural." "That must be Mr. Gideon, sir, himself," murmured Lady Bantry. "Rather distinguished-looking in a threadbare sort of way." Beside the entrance to the pavilion, a young woman sat at a small table, taking tickets and making change with deft, practiced movements. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair caught back in a practical knot, and a face that might have been pretty had it not worn such an expression of anxious watchfulness. "His daughter, I expect," said Miss Marple. "Poppy, I believe I heard someone call her." The girl looked up at that moment, and her eyes met Miss Marple's with a flash of something, intelligence, perhaps, or weariness, before she returned her attention to a customer. Near the ticket table, a young man in working clothes was examining what appeared to be a tangle of electrical wires. He was broad-shouldered and pleasant-faced, with the capable hands of one who worked with tools. Miss Marple noticed the way his gaze kept drifting toward Poppy Sir, and the slight softening of his expression when it did so. "That's Tom Liddon," supplied Lady Bantry, who made it her business to know everyone in the village. "Does odd jobs, repairs, that sort of thing?" "Quite reliable, Arthur says." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "How useful to have someone who understands electrical matters." "These modern fairground attractions, I understand, rely quite heavily upon electric lights and such mechanisms." They moved closer, drawn by the general drift of the crowd. The interior of the pavilion, glimpsed through the entrance, showed a confusion of mirrors reflecting and re-reflecting, multiplying the lamps until it seemed a palace of glittering light. "Gives me quite a headache to look at it," confessed Lady Bantry. "Mirrors," said Miss Marple quietly, "are peculiar things. They show us what appears to be truth, but is in fact only a reflection, reversed. You know, not quite the same thing at all." Before Lady Bantry could respond to this somewhat cryptic observation, a new figure appeared at the edge of the green. Mrs. Ellen stoutly moved with the unhurried grace of one accustomed to being observed, her pale gray dress immaculate, her lace parasol held at precisely the correct angle. She paused, surveying the fair with an expression of cool distaste, before proceeding directly toward the pavilion. And with her, though maintaining a careful distance that suggested they were not together, came a man Miss Marple had not seen before. He was sleek, well-dressed in a way that spoke of London rather than the country, with oiled hair and a knowing smile. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of one who considered himself superior to his surroundings. "Who?" asked Miss Marple. "Is that gentleman?" Lady Bantry followed her gaze and frowned slightly. "That's Roland Ashby, some sort of entertainments agent, or so he claims. He's been staying at the Blue Boar for the past week, asking questions about the fair and talking about modernizing the green. Most people find him rather unpleasant." Miss Marple watched as Ashby approached Mr. Sir, and even from this distance she could see the showman's expression stiffen. Words were exchanged, though too quietly to be overheard. Sir shook his head with emphasis. Ashby smiled, but it was not a pleasant smile. Mrs. Stoutley, meanwhile, had paused near the entrance. She said something to Poppy Sir, her voice carrying that particular clarity of tone that indicated breeding and assurance. "I trust, my dear, that the proceedings will be conducted with proper decorum. The village has standards to maintain." Poppy flushed. "It's all quite respectable, ma'am. Father sees to that." "I'm certain he does." said Mrs. Stoutley in a tone that suggested she was certain of no such thing. She turned away, her parasol describing a graceful arc, and nearly collided with Roland Ashby. "Mrs. Stoutley," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "how delightful to encounter you here. I had not thought this sort of entertainment quite in your line." "Mr. Ashby," she replied, her voice cool as winter, "I might say the same of you. Though I suppose your professional interests draw you to such establishments." Something flickered in Ashby's eyes, a calculation quickly masked. "Indeed they do. And speaking of professional interests, perhaps we might continue our earlier conversation, the one regarding the future of this charming green." Mrs. Stoutley's expression did not change, but Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the tightening of her gloved fingers upon the parasol handle. "I have nothing further to say to you on that subject. Mr. Ashby, my position is quite clear." "Positions," said Ashby softly, "have a way of changing. Perhaps this evening, after you've enjoyed the Hall of Mirrors, they say it's quite disorienting inside. One loses track of which way is which." He moved away before she could respond, leaving Mrs. Stoutley standing very still, 2 spots of color burning in her pale cheeks. "Well," said Lady Bantry, "what was all that about?" "Nothing," said Miss Marple, but her fingers, holding her small beaded handbag, had tightened slightly. The crowd was thickening. Now, as the working day ended and the evening's entertainment beckoned, Mr. Sir climbed onto a small platform and raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, the show begins in 10 minutes! Experience the wonder of the ghost flicker. When the lights dim and spirits walk among the mirrors, hear the bell that signals their approach. All for 6pence, children half price. Step up, step up!" "Oh, Jane," said Lady Bantry, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Shall we? It looks like such fun." Miss Marple regarded the painted pavilion with its promise of mirrors and ghosts, and thought of Mrs. Stoutley's pale gloves, Roland Ashby's knowing smile, and Poppy Sir's anxious eyes. "Yes, Dolly dear," she said quietly, "I rather think we shall." And so, as the sun touched the horizon and the paraffin lamps burned brighter against the gathering dusk, Miss Jane Marple and Lady Bantry joined the queue for Sayre's Wonder Pavilion, where mirrors multiplied reality into confusion, and truth, as Miss Marple well knew, could be made to look like something else entirely. Chapter 2. Flicker Bell and a Fall. The interior of Sayre's Wonder Pavilion was, Miss Marple reflected as she stepped across the threshold, precisely the sort of place designed to confuse and disorient the senses, which was, she supposed, rather the point of a hall of mirrors. Poppy Sayre tore their tickets with a quick, practiced movement, her fingers barely pausing as she handed back the stubs. "Keep to the left, please, ladies. Follow the arrows on the floor. The ghost flicker happens at 9:10 sharp, so you have a few minutes to find your way about first." "Thank you, my dear," said Miss Marple, and stepped into the maze. Immediately her reflection sprang up on all sides, multiplied and distorted. To her left she appeared unnaturally tall and thin, like a lady drawn by a child with no sense of proportion. To her right she was squat and broad, as though someone had pressed her downward like dough. Ahead, in what seemed to be a corridor, but might equally have been a clever arrangement of angled glass, a dozen Miss Marples receded into infinity, each one growing smaller and dimmer until they vanished into shadow. "Good gracious," said Lady Bantry, whose own reflection surrounded her in equal profusion. "I look quite monstrous in that one, like something from a nightmare." "The distortion is achieved through curved glass," observed Miss Marple, moving carefully forward, "though I confess the effect is rather unsettling. One quite loses one's bearings." The floor was painted black, and the walls, where they were not mirrors, were covered in dark velvet that absorbed what little light the blue-tinted electric bulbs provided. Arrows had been painted in luminous paint, glowing faintly to guide visitors through the maze, but even these seemed to multiply in the reflections until one could not be entirely certain which was the genuine arrow and which merely its image. Other visitors moved through the corridors around them, their presence announced by giggles and exclamations. A young couple brushed past, the girl squealing as she caught sight of her elongated reflection. Two boys darted ahead, laughing, only to collide with what they had thought was an opening, but proved to be a mirror. "One could quite easily become lost in here," remarked Lady Bantry, keeping close to Miss Marple's elbow. "I'm not at all sure I care for it, Jane." Miss Marple said nothing, but her observant eyes were noting details. Here, a seam where two mirrors met. There, a small gap at the base of the velvet skirting, where the black paint of the floor gave way to unvarnished wood. The temperature, she noticed, was not quite even throughout the maze. In some corners, the air was close and warm from the press of bodies and the heat of the electric lamps. In others, there seemed to be a faint coolness, as though a draft came from somewhere. They turned a corner, following an arrow, and found themselves in what appeared to be a long gallery. The mirrors here were arranged to create the illusion of endless space, reflecting back and forth upon each other, so that one seemed to be standing in a corridor that stretched away forever in both directions. Electric bulbs and blue glass shades hung at intervals, their light cold and spectral. "This must be where the ghosts appear," whispered Lady Bantry with a delicious shiver. Indeed, the effect was already uncanny. In the multiple reflections, figures seemed to flicker and move in ways that did not quite match reality. A person walking toward you might appear to be walking away in the mirror. Someone standing still might seem, in the corner of one's eye, to be gliding forward. It was here that Miss Marple caught sight of Mrs. Ellen Stoutly. The widow stood some distance down the gallery, or what appeared to be distance, though with mirrors it was difficult to judge. Her pale dress showed clearly against the dark velvet, and her parasol was held loosely in her left hand, its lace-covered shaft resting against her arm, while she gazed at her own reflections with an expression that was difficult to read. Disdain, perhaps, or calculation, or something else entirely. "There's Mrs. Stoutly," murmured Lady Bantry. "I wonder what she makes of all this. Probably considering it most unsuitable for respectable village entertainment." But before Miss Marple could reply, the lights changed. It happened without warning, as Mr. Sir had promised it would. The blue bulbs dimmed further, sinking almost to darkness, and in that same instant a bell clanged once, harsh and jangling, somewhere in the depths of the pavilion. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, multiplied by the mirrors into a cacophony that made several women gasp. The ghost flicker, breathed someone nearby. And indeed, in the dimness, with only the faintest glow from the lamps, the reflections took on a life of their own. Shadows moved where no one walked. Faces loomed and receded in the glass. The very walls seemed to shift and breathe. Miss Marple, who did not believe in ghosts but had a healthy respect for human ingenuity, kept her attention focused. This, she sensed, was the moment when something important might occur. People in darkness and confusion revealed their true natures. And tricks, as she had learned long ago in her careful observation of human behavior, were best performed when everyone was looking in the wrong direction. In the dimness, she could still make out Mrs. Stoutly's pale dress, a ghostly blur in the gallery ahead. Or was it ahead? With the mirrors and the changed lighting, one could not be entirely certain. The parasol was still visible, though now it seemed to be in the widow's right hand rather than her left. Miss Marple frowned slightly at this inconsistency. But before she could pursue the thought, a new sound cut through the darkness. A boy's voice, high and frightened, crying out somewhere in the maze, There's someone on the floor, mister. There's a man. The blue lights flickered, then strengthened slightly, though they did not return to their previous brightness. Voices rose in confusion. Someone called for Mr. Sir. Footsteps hurried on the painted floor, creating a strange shuffling echo in the mirrored corridors. "Jane," said Lady Bantry, gripping her friend's arm. "What's happened?" "I rather fear," said Miss Marple quietly, "that something quite serious has occurred." "Come, Dolly, but carefully. These floors are treacherous and people in a panic can be dangerous." They made their way forward, following the sound of voices. Others were converging on the same spot, drawn by curiosity or concern. The maze, which had seemed so confusing only moments before, now seemed to funnel everyone toward a single point, as though designed for precisely this purpose. They turned a final corner and found themselves in a small alcove where the mirrors created a blind kink, a place where three reflective surfaces met at odd angles. And there, sitting with his back propped against the glass, his legs extended before him and his eyes wide with surprise, was Roland Ashby. Dr. Haydock was already kneeling beside him, his medical bag somehow produced from nowhere, as such things always are when doctors are present. His hands moved with quick efficiency, checking for pulse, examining with gentle but thorough touches. "Stand back." "Please," said Mr. Kerr, who had appeared from somewhere. His showman's patter dropped entirely. Give the doctor room to work. But Miss Marple, even from her position several feet away, could see what Dr. Haydock would confirm in another moment: the small dark patch that stained Ashby's waistcoat just below his left ribs. The peculiar angle of his body, as though he had simply folded forward and then toppled sideways. The expression on his face not of pain, but of absolute astonishment. Dr. Haydock looked up, his face grave. "I'm afraid he's gone." A stab wound, narrow and deep, angled upward. Death would have been very rapid, possibly within seconds. A collective gasp ran through the gathered crowd. Someone began to sob, though whether from genuine distress or simple shock, Miss Marple could not have said. "But that's impossible," said Tom Liddon, who had pushed through the crowd. "No one was near him. I was just around that corner there, fixing a loose connection, and I saw him standing alone. No one came past me." "That's right," said another voice, a woman Miss Marple did not recognize. "My husband and I were in the gallery, and we saw Mrs. Stoutley there with her parasol, waving it about like she was trying to find her way. She couldn't have been anywhere near this spot." "I saw her too," said someone else, "in that long corridor with all the reflections. She was quite far from here." Mrs. Stoutley herself now appeared, her face pale but composed. "I assure you I was nowhere near Mr. Ashby. I find the very suggestion offensive." Inspector Slack, who had been attending the fair in his off-duty hours, pushed forward with the heavy authority of the law. Now then, everyone stay calm. Dr. Haydock, you're certain about the cause of death?" "Quite certain." A narrow blade thrust upward beneath the ribs with considerable force. A single blow, expertly placed. Slack surveyed the crowd with his habitual expression of suspicion. "Did anyone see anything? Any struggle? Any argument?" Heads shook. Murmurs of denial rippled through the gathering. "It was dark," said Tom Liddon. "The ghost flicker, you know. The lights went dim, the bell rang, and then that boy started shouting." "Convenient," muttered Slack. He turned to Mr. Sayre. "How long does this flicker business last?" 30 seconds, said Sir, his face drawn. "Just half a minute of dimmed lights, and then they come back up. It's timed by a switch on the electrical panel. I was operating it myself at the entrance. So during those 30 seconds, in near darkness, someone managed to stab Mr. Ashby without being seen, and without anyone nearby noticing. So it would appear." "Inspector," said Miss Marple softly. Slack whirled on her. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be mixed up in this somehow. I am merely an observer, Inspector, though I must say the circumstances are rather peculiar. Peculiar? Said Slack with heavy irony. That's one word for it. Murder in a house of mirrors where no one saw anything, and everyone's got an alibi because they were somewhere else entirely. He shook his head. This is going to be a nightmare to sort out. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes had gone to the glass panel just above where Ashby's body rested. There, barely visible in the dim blue light, was something that made her elderly heart beat just a fraction faster. On the mirror, at approximately face height, there was a small oval patch where the glass seemed slightly clouded, as though someone had been standing very close to it, close enough that their breath had misted the surface. But standing on which side of the glass? Miss Marple wondered, and breathing toward which direction? She glanced down at the black skirting board where it met the floor. There, caught in a crack, was something that glittered faintly when the light struck it at the proper angle. Fine particles like dust, but with a metallic sheen. Inspector, she said quietly, I wonder if you might preserve this area exactly as it is. I believe there may be more here than immediately meets the eye. Slack grunted. This whole place is nothing but meeting the eye. Mirrors everywhere you look. How am I supposed to tell what's real and what's reflection? Precisely, said Miss Marple. An excellent question, Inspector. How indeed. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices breath on the wrong pane. The pavilion had been cleared of visitors within the hour, though not without considerable complaint from those who felt their evening's entertainment had been unfairly curtailed. Inspector Slack, with his customary lack of tact, had informed them that murder trumped amusement, which had done little to improve the general atmosphere. Miss Marple had remained, as she so often did in such circumstances, quietly in the background. Lady Bantry, who knew her friend well, had made no attempt to coax her away, and had indeed settled herself on a folding chair near the entrance, with the air of one prepared to wait as long as necessary. The body had been photographed and examined where it lay, and was now being removed by 2 constables under Dr. Haydock's supervision. The doctor paused as he passed Miss Marple, his expression thoughtful. You saw something, Jane, he said quietly. It was not a question. Perhaps, she replied, though I should very much like to examine the spot more closely before I commit myself to any theory. Haydock nodded. The wound was remarkably precise. Whoever did this knew exactly where to strike. A single thrust angled upward between the ribs, piercing the heart. Death, as I said, would have been nearly instantaneous. He lowered his voice further. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds on his hands. He either knew his attacker and trusted them, or never saw the blow coming. In darkness, murmured Miss Marple, one might easily fail to see a great many things. Once the body had been taken away, Inspector Slack turned his attention to the scene itself. He stood hands on hips, surveying the blind alcove with its confusing angles of mirror. Right, he said, addressing no one in particular. Let's think about this logically. Man is stabbed during a blackout or near enough to one. Killer must have been close by, but everyone swears they saw everyone else somewhere different. So either they're all lying or... He trailed off, frowning at his own reflection, which frowned back at him from 3 different angles. All the mirrors are deceiving them, replied Miss Marple gently. She had moved closer to the spot where Ashby had fallen, and was now standing very still, her head tilted slightly, as though listening to something only she could hear. Deceiving them how? Demanded Slack. A mirror shows what's in front of it. Can't show what isn't there. Quite true, Inspector, but it can show what is there in a most misleading fashion. She gestured delicately toward the long gallery that led away from the alcove. Consider, for instance, that corridor. When one looks down it, one sees reflections within reflections. A person standing at the far end might appear to be close by, or vice versa. And in dim light, with a confusion of multiple images, one might easily mistake where someone truly is. Slack grunted, unconvinced, but unable to immediately argue the point. Miss Marple had now moved to stand directly beside the mirror panel where Ashby's head had rested. She removed one glove, laying it carefully in her handbag, and extended her bare hand toward the glass. Her fingertips hovered just above the surface, not quite touching. "May I have your torch, Inspector? The light here is insufficient for proper observation." Slack handed over his electric torch with obvious reluctance. Miss Marple switched it on and directed the beam at a shallow angle across the mirror's surface. Immediately, something became visible that would be nearly impossible to see in the diffused blue light of the pavilion's lamps. There, at approximately the height where an adult's face might be, was a faint oval mark. The glass within this oval appeared very slightly clouded, as though moisture had condensed upon it, and then partially evaporated. "Breath," said Miss Marple softly. Someone stood very close to this mirror and breathed upon it. "The moisture has mostly dissipated, but in this cool air traces remain." "So," said Slack. "Ashby was standing right there." He breathed on it himself. But that is the curious thing, Inspector." Miss Marple moved the torch beam slightly. "Mr. Ashby fell forward and to his left, did he not?" Dr. Haydock found him slumped against the glass there, with his head turned away from this particular panel. "Yet the breath mark is here, on the panel behind where he sat, and at full standing height." She paused, letting this sink in. "Moreover, if you observe carefully, you will notice that the breath mark is on this side of the glass, facing into the alcove. If Mr. Ashby had made it standing where he was when he was struck, it would be on the outer curve of the glass, not the inner surface." Slack leaned in, squinting. "Are you saying someone was breathing on the mirror from behind it?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied with precision, "that someone was standing very close to this glass, and that their breath condensed upon its surface. Whether they stood on this side or the other is a question that bears investigation." She now directed the torch beam downward to where the mirror met the black painted skirting board. "And here, Inspector, you will observe something else of interest." On the dark wood of the skirting, barely visible, was a scattering of fine particles that caught the light with a metallic glitter. Miss Marple produced a small handkerchief from her handbag and used it to dab gently at the particles. When she held the handkerchief up to the light, the fabric showed a gray smudge that sparkled faintly. "Silvering," she said, "the reflective coating from the back of a mirror. It flakes away when the backing is disturbed or when glass is cut." "Rather like mica, wouldn't you say?" Slack was now paying closer attention. He knelt down, his knees creaking, and examined the skirting more carefully. "There's more of it here in this crack. And look, the velvet that covers the wall. It's been disturbed here at the bottom. The tacks are newer than the others." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Precisely. The velvet has been removed and replaced, and recently. The question is, why?" She moved her examination to the black velvet backing of the mirror itself, running the torch beam slowly across its surface. Most of the velvet was uniform, absorbing light completely. But in one small spot, low down and to the left, there was something different. "Inspector, if you would look here, the velvet appears to have a small puncture, barely larger than a pinhead." Slack produced a magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the spot closely. "You're right. Something's poked through from behind. Something narrow and pointed. A stiletto blade, perhaps?" suggested Miss Marple. "Or some other thin instrument. Dr. Haydock said the wound was made by a narrow blade." "But that doesn't make sense," protested Slack. "The blow was struck with considerable force," the doctor said. "You can't stab a man through a mirror. The glass would stop it." Unless, said Miss Marple quietly, the glass was not in the way, unless there was an opening of some kind behind the mirror through which the blow could be delivered. She straightened, her elderly back protesting slightly at the sustained bending. I believe, Inspector, that we should investigate what lies behind these mirrors. Mr. Cyr mentioned that the pavilion requires maintenance, cleaning, access to the backs of the glass. There must be a way to reach the reverse side of these panels. A service passage, muttered Slack. He turned and bellowed, Tyr! Get in here! The showman appeared promptly, his face haggard. Yes, Inspector? Is there a passage behind these mirrors? A way to get at the backs of them for cleaning and such? Sir hesitated, then nodded. Yes, there is. It's just a narrow run, really, between the maze walls and the outer shell of the pavilion. We have to be able to reach the mirrors to polish them, replace bulbs, fix the mechanisms for the ghost. Effects. Show me, commanded Slack. They followed Sarah around the outside of the alcove, through a door that Miss Marple had not previously noticed. So cleverly was it concealed within the painted design of the pavilion's exterior. Beyond was a narrow corridor, unlit save for what illumination came through gaps in the structure. The air here was noticeably cooler. Cyr produced a hurricane lamp and lit it, casting a wavering glow over the passage. The inner wall was the back of the mirror panels, showing their wooden frames and the dull, flaking silvering that gave them their reflective properties. Between the frames ran narrow gaps where one could glimpse through into the maze itself. This is the maintenance run, said Sarah. Only me and Poppy know about it, really. And Tom, I suppose, since he does our electrical work. Anyone else? Demanded Slack. No one. I keep it locked when we're open to the public. Can't have people wandering back here, damaging the equipment, or getting hurt in the dark. Miss Marple moved along the passage, her torch beam playing over the frames and gaps. At one point, corresponding to where the alcove lay on the other side, she stopped. Inspector, if you would shine your light here. The wooden frame at this point showed fresh marks, as though something had scraped against it. And on the narrow sill behind one of the glass panels, barely wide enough to accommodate a hand, there was a small, dark smear. Dr. Haydock, who had returned out of professional curiosity, leaned in to examine it. He produced a clean swab from his bag and carefully collected a sample. Blood, he said after a moment, or I'd stake my reputation on it. And here, said Miss Marple, pointing to a small tuft of black velvet caught on a splinter of wood, we have evidence that something passed through this gap, something wrapped in velvet, perhaps to muffle any sound. She turned to face the others, her expression grave. I believe, gentlemen, that we have discovered how Mr. Ashby was killed. The weapon was thrust through a gap behind the mirror during the moment of darkness, when he could not see the blow coming. The killer stood here in this service passage and struck through the opening in the glass. Slack stared at her, then at the narrow gap, then back at her. You're saying someone was back here during the ghost flicker? I am saying precisely that, Inspector. Someone who knew about this passage, someone who had access to it, and someone who knew exactly where Mr. Ashby would be standing when the lights went down. In the flickering lamplight, the implications of this hung heavy in the air. The killer had been there all along, separated from their victim by nothing more than a thin pane of glass and a curtain of velvet, watching, waiting, and when the moment came, striking with cold precision through the barrier that was meant to protect. Right, said Slack grimly. I want statements from everyone who had access to this passage. Cyr, your daughter, and that Liddon fellow. And I want to know where each of them was at 9:10 tonight. But Miss Marple was looking at something else. On the dusty floor of the service passage, faint in the lamplight, was the impression of a shoe. A small shoe, narrow and elegant. Not the sort of shoe worn by showmen or mechanics. Not at all. Chapter 4. Left hand, right hand. The following morning brought one of those clear, bright days that seemed designed to mock the darker aspects of human nature. Miss Marple sat in her garden, ostensibly attending to her knitting, though the gray wool had progressed very little in the past hour. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the previous evening with the methodical care of one sorting through a tangle of thread to find the loose end. Lady Bantry arrived shortly after 11, having telephoned ahead to announce her intention. She found her friend in the arbor, surrounded by late-blooming roses that filled the air with their heavy scent. "Well, Jane," she said, settling into the wicker chair with a sigh. "The entire village is talking of nothing else. Mrs. Price at the butcher's had 3 different theories before I'd even asked for my lamb chops. And Miss Weatherby insists it must have been some criminal from London who followed poor Mr. Ashby down from town." "Poor Mr. Ashby," repeated Miss Marple with a slight emphasis on the adjective. "How interesting that everyone is suddenly so sympathetic to a man who, by all accounts, was thoroughly disliked." "Oh, well," said Lady Bantry, "one doesn't speak ill of the dead, does one? Though I'll admit he wasn't pleasant. But Jane, what I wanted to ask you about is something rather odd that occurred to me last night after we got home." "Yes, Dolly?" "It's about Mrs. Stoutley. You remember how all those people said they saw her in the long gallery during the ghost flicker, with her parasol and everything?" "I remember it very well indeed." Lady Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping, though there was no one to overhear. "The thing is, Jane, I've known Eleanor Stoutley for years. We've worked together on jumble sales and church fetes and all sorts of committees, and I've noticed something about her that I'd never really thought about until last night." "Do go on." "She always carries her handbag on her right side. Always. I've seen her dozens of times. And it's automatic with her. Right arm through the handle. Handbag on the right." Lady Bantry paused. "Significantly, but those witnesses said they saw her. With the parasol in her left hand, that she was waving it about. In her left hand, Miss Marple's knitting needles had gone still. Are you quite certain about this, Dolly?" "About Mrs. Stoutley's habit with her handbag? Absolutely certain. In fact, I remarked on it once because I'm forever switching mine from side to side, and she said she found it more convenient to keep to one side consistently. She's very particular about such things." "How very observant of you, my dear. And you're quite right to mention it, because it presents us with a rather interesting question." "Which is this," said Miss Marple, setting down her knitting entirely. "If Mrs. Stoutley habitually carries items in her right hand or on her right arm, why would multiple witnesses claim to have seen her holding her parasol in her left hand during the ghost flicker?" Lady Bantry blinked. "Perhaps she'd changed hands. One does shift things about. One does indeed. But consider, Dolly, what we know about mirrors. They reverse what we see, do they not? Left becomes right, and right becomes left." Understanding dawned slowly across Lady Bantry's face. "You mean they didn't actually see her at all? They saw her reflection." "I mean that what they saw may not have been what they thought they saw. A reflection in a mirror shows everything reversed. If Mrs. Stoutley was standing to one side of a two-way mirror, holding her parasol in her right hand, as is her custom, anyone viewing her reflection would see her holding it in her left hand." "Good heavens," breathed Lady Bantry. "So she could have been somewhere else entirely, and people only thought they saw her in the gallery because they were looking at her reflection. It is a possibility worth considering. Mirrors, as I observed yesterday, are peculiar things. They show truth, but they show it backwards." Lady Bantry sat back, her mind clearly racing. "But if she wasn't in the gallery, where was she?" "That," said Miss Marple quietly, "is precisely what I intend to discover." She rose from her chair with the slight stiffness that came with age, but her expression was alert and determined. "I believe I shall take a walk into the village. Dolly, there are 1 or 2 small matters I should like to clarify. Shall I come with you?" "If you wouldn't mind, dear. 2 pairs of eyes are often better than 1, though perhaps not when mirrors are involved." Their first stop was the green, where Sayre's Wonder Pavilion still stood, though it was shuttered and silent now, with a policeman stationed at the entrance. The fair stalls around it were open. However, their proprietors, making what trade they could despite the shadow that had fallen over the festivities, Miss Marple's destination was Mrs. Hatch's toffee stall, a cheerful construction of striped canvas and wooden boards. Mrs. Hatch herself, a comfortable woman of middle years, was arranging her wares with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, Mrs. Hatch," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I wonder if I might ask you a question or 2 about last evening." Mrs. Hatch looked up, her expression growing cautious. "The police have already been round, Miss Marple. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much." "I'm sure you did, dear. I'm merely curious about one small detail. I believe Mrs. Stoutley purchased some toffees from you yesterday evening." "That's right. 2 of them, wrapped in paper, just as the lights were doing that flicker thing inside the pavilion." "And did you notice anything about Mrs. Stoutley at the time? Her manner, perhaps, or anything she was carrying?" Mrs. Hatch thought for a moment. "She had her parasol with her, that fancy lace one. She laid it down on my counter while she got out her purse, flat-like, not hooked over her arm the way ladies usually do." "Flat on the counter," repeated Miss Marple. "How interesting. And did you happen to notice if there was anything unusual about the parasol? Any marks or damage?" "Can't say as I noticed anything particular, though she did pick it up careful-like, as if it were delicate. Held it by the shaft rather than the handle." Miss Marple thanked her and moved away, Lady Bantry following with barely contained curiosity. "What was all that about the parasol?" asked Lady Bantry. "I'm not entirely certain yet," admitted Miss Marple. "But I should very much like to examine that parasol more closely. A lace parasol, particularly one of good quality, is a delicate thing. The ferrule at the tip, the metal point that protects the end, can become damaged if the parasol is used roughly or dropped." "You think she used it as a weapon?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that a parasol ferrule, if it were fitted with something sharp and narrow, could inflict precisely the sort of wound that killed Mr. Ashby. And I think that if such a parasol had been used to push through a narrow gap behind a mirror, it might well collect traces of the silvering from the glass backing." Lady Bantry stared at her. "Jane Marple, you're saying Eleanor Stoutley murdered that man with her parasol." "I am saying nothing of the sort, Dolly. I am merely following where the evidence leads. And the evidence, I must say, is becoming quite suggestive." They walked on in silence for a moment, past the duck pond, where village children were tossing breadcrumbs despite the morning's dramatic revelations. "There's one thing I don't understand," said Lady Bantry at last. "Even if Mrs. Stoutley did it, how could she? She would have had to get into that service passage, and Mr. Sir said only he and his daughter and Tom Liddon knew about it." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "but we have only Mr. Sear's word for that, haven't we? And people, Dolly, are remarkably careless about locked doors and secret passages. Someone always tells someone else. A confidence shared in strictest secrecy becomes common knowledge before one knows it." She paused at the corner of the green, her gaze resting on the shuttered pavilion. "No. What interests me most is not how Mrs. Stoutley might have gained access to the passage, but why she would need to create such an elaborate alibi. For that, I think we must understand more about Mr. Ashby himself, and what hold he might have had over a respectable widow of St. Mary Mead." "Blackmail?" whispered Lady Bantry. "It is a possibility we must consider, and if Mr. Ashby was indeed a blackmailer, then Mrs. Stoutley would not be the first person to commit murder to protect a secret. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful as they turned toward home. Though I must say, Dolly, it would take a very great secret indeed to drive someone to such lengths, and a very cold determination to plan it so carefully. Do you think she did it, Jane? I think, said Miss Marple slowly, that mirrors show us many things, but not always the truth. And I think that before we condemn Mrs. Stoutley or anyone else, we must be very certain indeed that we are not being deceived by reflections. Chapter 5. The Door with Backwards Letters, Inspector. Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon, in a state of barely suppressed frustration. He found her in the sitting room, where she was arranging some late dahlias in a crystal vase with the same careful attention she brought to all her activities. Miss Marple, he said without preamble, I've spent the entire morning taking statements, and I'm no closer to sorting this business out than I was last night. Everyone saw everyone else in impossible places, and the only people with access to that blasted service passage all have alibis. Do sit down, Inspector. You look quite worn out. May I offer you some tea? Slack subsided into a chair with a grunt. Sear was operating the lighting switch at the entrance, with half a dozen witnesses. His daughter was taking tickets until just before the flicker. Then she went to count the cash box in full view of the queue, and Tom Liddon was fixing a loose wire at the far end of the maze, where 3 separate people saw him working. Most comprehensive, murmured Miss Marple, pouring tea with a steady hand. And yet someone managed to be in that service passage. That's just it. According to Sayre, the passage was locked. He swears he had the only key on his person all evening. Locks, observed Miss Marple, can sometimes be less secure than we imagine. A determined person with even modest skill can often manage them. Or perhaps there was another entrance that Mr. Sayre has forgotten about. Slack seized on this. That's exactly what I've been thinking. I want to go back to that pavilion and examine it properly in daylight. Would you care to accompany me? You seemed to notice things last night that I missed. I should be delighted, Inspector. They found the pavilion much changed in the afternoon light. What had seemed mysterious and theatrical by lamplight now appeared merely shabby, the painted decorations showing their age, and the mirrors revealing smudges and fingerprints. The constable on duty unlocked the entrance, and they stepped inside. Without the blue-tinted lamps and the press of visitors, the maze was easier to navigate. Miss Marple moved slowly, examining each turn and alcove with careful attention. When they reached the spot where Ashby had died, she stopped. Inspector, would you mind illuminating that wall panel there, the one that appears to be a dead end? Slack directed his torch at the indicated spot. What appeared to be solid wall was actually a clever arrangement of mirror and velvet, creating the illusion of an impenetrable barrier. Miss Marple moved closer, her hand extended. If you observe carefully, you'll notice a slight draft coming from this point. Not much, but perceptible if one is paying attention. She ran her fingers along the edge of the velvet strip that bordered the baseboard. And here, Inspector, the fabric is newer than the surrounding material. The tacks are brighter, less tarnished. So someone's been working on this section recently, said Slack. It would appear so. Now, if you would be so kind as to shine your light through this gap in the velvet where it meets the frame. Slack obliged, and both of them leaned in to peer through the narrow opening. Beyond the glass in the service passage, something was visible that Miss Marple had noticed the previous evening but had not had opportunity to examine closely. A door, or rather, the painted letters that marked a door, visible through the two-way mirror. From where they stood in the maze, the letters read correctly, "Exit." That's odd, said Slack slowly. If we're looking at those letters through a mirror, shouldn't they be backwards? Precisely, Inspector. You've grasped it exactly. When one views writing in a mirror, it appears reversed. Yet these letters read correctly from our position, which means we're not looking at a reflection, finished Slack. We're looking straight through the glass at the actual door behind it. Just so. This particular panel is not a mirror at all, or at least not entirely. It's a two-way mirror designed to be transparent from one side under certain lighting conditions. During the ghost flicker, when the lights change, this glass would allow someone in the service passage to see through into the maze. And more importantly, it would allow someone in the maze to see into the passage, though they might not realize they were seeing reality rather than reflection. Slack was beginning to understand. So, when people said they saw Mrs. Stoutley in the long gallery, they might have been seeing her actual position in the service passage reflected in other mirrors, or they might have been seeing her through this two-way glass standing in the passage itself, and assuming they were viewing a reflection because that is what one expects in a hall of mirrors. Miss Marple moved to examine the velvet skirting more closely, and here, if you look carefully, you can see where the fabric has been disturbed. There are tack holes that don't align with the current tacks. Someone removed this velvet panel, perhaps to access something behind the glass, and then replaced it, but not quite perfectly. She straightened, brushing dust from her gloves. I believe, Inspector, that there is a way to open this panel from either side, a catch or button of some kind, concealed, but accessible to someone who knew where to look. They made their way around to the service passage, entering through the concealed door that Cyr had shown them the previous evening. In the narrow corridor behind the mirrors, Miss Marple moved to the section corresponding to the dead-end alcove. If you would run your hands along the frame here, Inspector, feel for anything that seems unusual. Slack did so, his large fingers surprisingly delicate in their exploration. There's something here, a button of some kind, covered in felt, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Press it gently if you would. There was a soft click, and a section of the mirror panel shifted inward, revealing a narrow slit perhaps 6 inches wide and a foot tall. Through this opening, the alcove was clearly visible. Good Lord, breathed Slack. So someone could reach through. Here, thrust a weapon through, and strike anyone, standing in that spot, precisely, and then close the panel again, leaving very little evidence save the traces we discovered. A few flakes of silvering, a breath mark on the glass, a tiny puncture in the velvet where the weapon pushed through. Miss Marple peered through the opening, gauging angles and distances. Mr. Ashby was a tall man, was he not? If he were standing facing away from this panel, perhaps looking at his own distorted reflection in the mirrors. Opposite, a blow struck through this opening and angled upward would reach precisely where Dr. Haydock found the wound. But how did the killer know Ashby would be standing there? Demanded Slack. I rather suspect he was told to stand there. Inspector, told to meet someone in that particular spot during the ghost flicker, when the lights would be dim and they could speak privately. Mr. Ashby, we know, was interested in the fair and its operation. Perhaps he was told he would learn something to his advantage. Slack closed the panel with a decisive push. It settled back into place, leaving barely a seam visible. So, we're looking for someone who knew about this mechanism, which brings us back to Cyr, his daughter and Liddon, or someone to whom one of them confided the secret, added Miss Marple gently. People do talk, Inspector. A daughter might mention it to a friend. A young man in love might reveal it to the object of his affections, or someone observant might simply discover it on their own through careful exploration. You're thinking of Mrs. Stoutley. I am thinking that Mrs. Stoutley is an intelligent woman who takes an interest in village affairs. If she visited the pavilion before yesterday evening, she might well have noticed things that others overlooked. The draft, for instance. The peculiar way the exit letters read correctly instead of reversed. These are details that an observant person would find curious. They emerged from the service passage into the afternoon sunlight. Slack stood for a moment, squinting at the painted exterior of the pavilion. "All right," he said at last. "I'll grant you this was cleverly done, but I still need evidence that puts Mrs. Stoutley or anyone else in that passage at the time of the murder. Theories are all very well, Miss Marple, but they won't stand up in court." "Indeed they won't, Inspector, which is why I believe we must examine Mrs. Stoutley's parasol. I have a feeling it may tell us a great deal." "Her parasol? Why on earth would she let us examine it if she used it to commit murder?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, Inspector, she has cleaned it thoroughly and believes herself quite safe. Pride, you know, often comes before a fall, and Mrs. Stoutley has always been a very proud woman. Chapter 6. Tickets. That don't add up." The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into that peculiar state of excitement that follows a sensational event. Conversations at the post office were conducted in lowered voices, though everyone present could hear perfectly well, and speculation ran rampant at the Wednesday market despite Mrs. Dane's best efforts to maintain a tone of respectful solemnity. Miss Marple, however, was engaged in more practical pursuits. She had spent the better part of the morning in quiet conversation with Agnes Reed, the postmistress's niece, who had been working the entrance to the pavilion alongside Poppy Sir on the evening in question. Agnes was a sensible girl of 19, not given to flights of fancy, and she answered Miss Marple's gentle questions with admirable precision. "You were helping with the tickets?" "I understand," Miss Marple asked, her knitting needles clicking steadily as they sat in the postmistress's parlor. "Yes, Miss Marple. Miss Sir asked me to help because the queue was so long. She was taking the money and tearing tickets, and I was keeping count with the clicker." Agnes demonstrated with an imaginary device in her hand. "Every person who went through I clicked once. It's how Mr. Sir knows how many visitors he's had. How very efficient. And what was your final count for the evening?" Agnes consulted a small notebook she produced from her pocket. 206 clicks, Miss Marple. I wrote it down just as we were closing up, before all the dreadful business happened." 206, repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And Miss Sears' tickets. Did you happen to notice how many she had torn?" "Well, she had a roll of 250 to start with, and there were 45 left at the end. So that would be 205 torn." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a fraction of a second. 205 tickets torn, but 206 clicks. Counted. "Yes, though I suppose I might have clicked twice by accident. It was rather hectic with the crowd and all." "I'm sure it was, my dear. Tell me, did you notice anyone leaving by any route other than the main entrance? A staff door, perhaps, or a service exit?" Agnes frowned in concentration. "Not that I saw, but then I was facing inward, watching people come in. I wasn't really paying attention to who might have left early or gone out a different way." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to the Blue Boar, where she found Inspector Slack taking his lunch in the private dining room. He looked up as she entered, resignation written across his features. "I suppose you've uncovered something else?" he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Possibly, Inspector." "Tell me, did you ask Mr. Sir about his ticket count for the evening?" "I did. He said 205 people entered the pavilion based on the torn tickets, and yet the mechanical counter shows 206 clicks, a discrepancy of 1. Slack set down his fork. "You're saying someone went through who didn't have a ticket? Or someone went through twice, once with a ticket through the main entrance, and once without a ticket through a different route. The service door, for instance. But that door was locked. I could swear to it. Locks can be picked, Inspector, or keys can be borrowed and copied. Or perhaps the door was unlocked earlier in the day by someone who planned ahead. Slack pushed his plate away, his lunch forgotten. If someone used the service entrance during the evening, they could have entered the maintenance passage without being seen by the crowds. Precisely. They would appear to enter the pavilion normally, be counted and ticketed like everyone else, but then slip into the service corridor through the exterior door while the ghost flicker provided cover and distraction, and then exit the same way after committing the murder, rejoining the crowd as though they'd never left. Slack drummed his fingers on the table. Mrs. Stoutley purchased those toffees during the flicker. You said Mrs. Hatch's stall is right beside the service entrance. It is indeed a most convenient location. Slack stood abruptly. Right, I want Poppy, sir, and Tom Liddon brought in for further questioning. They're the ones who know that pavilion inside and out. Miss Marple rose as well, gathering her handbag. Inspector, before you do that, might I suggest we speak with them together here at the pavilion? Sometimes people are more forthcoming in familiar surroundings. They found Poppy and Tom at the shuttered fair, sitting on the steps of the painted wagon. The young woman's eyes were red-rimmed, and Tom's arm rested protectively across her shoulders. Both looked up wearily as Slack and Miss Marple approached. Miss Sir, said Slack without preamble, I need to know about the service entrance to your father's pavilion. Who has keys? Poppy's voice was barely above a whisper. Just father and me. And Tom has one too, for when he works on the electrics. No one else? No one. Tom spoke up, his voice defensive. What's this about, Inspector? We've told you everything we know. The ticket count doesn't match the clicker count, said Slack bluntly. Someone entered that pavilion who shouldn't have been there. Poppy's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, I thought I might have torn wrong. The crowd was pressing so, and Agnes was counting so fast. Or someone used the service door, said Slack, which means either you, your father, or Tom here let them in, or they had a key they shouldn't have had. We didn't let anyone in. Poppy's distress was evident. Father would never allow it. He's so particular about keeping the passage secure. Miss Marple intervened gently. My dear, has anyone ever asked you about the service passage? Shown curiosity about how the pavilion works? Poppy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Mrs. Stoutley did, actually. When she came round last week with the Improvement Society to inspect our license and such, she asked very particularly about fire exits and safety routes. Father showed her the service door and explained that it led to the maintenance corridor. Did he show her how to unlock it? He might have. He was trying to be helpful, to show we were all above board and safe. Poppy's voice broke. Have we done something terribly wrong? Tom's arm tightened around her shoulders. It's all right. Poppy, we haven't done anything. But Miss Marple noticed his eyes when he said it, dark with worry and something else, knowledge, perhaps, or suspicion that he dared not voice. Tom, she said quietly, you were fixing a wire during the ghost flicker. Where exactly were you working? At the far end of the maze by the laughing corridor. There was a loose connection in the lighting circuit. And could you see the service door from where you were working? Tom's jaw tightened. No, Miss Marple, I couldn't see it at all. But you could have heard it open, perhaps. It's a heavy door, I imagine, with hinges that might creak. A long silence followed. Finally, Tom said, there was a lot of noise during the flicker, people squealing and laughing, the bell clanging. I might have heard the door, or I might not have. I couldn't say for certain, but his expression suggested that he could say if pressed, and that what he might say would implicate someone he was reluctant to name. Miss Marple looked from Poppy's frightened face to Tom's troubled one, and understood. These young people knew something, or suspected something, that they feared would bring ruin upon the fair and their livelihoods. "Inspector," she said, "I believe we've established that the service entrance could have been accessed by someone other than the Sears or Mr. Liddon. The question now is not who had the opportunity, but who had the motive." And for that answer, she knew, they would need to examine not just parasols and tickets, but the darker secrets that lay hidden beneath St. Mary Mead's respectable surface. Chapter 7. The Parasol for Rule with Silver Dust. Mrs. Eleanor Stoutley received Inspector Slack and Miss Marple in her drawing-room with a cool composure that had made her both respected and slightly feared in St. Mary Mead. Her house, a handsome Georgian property on the edge of the village, spoke of good taste and modest wealth carefully maintained. "Inspector," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before the fireplace, "I cannot imagine what further questions you might have for me. I've already provided my statement." "Just a few details to clear up, Mrs. Stoutley," said Slack, his manner heavy with official authority. "Miss Marple here has been helping with the investigation." Mrs. Stoutley's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, and something flickered in her eyes before the composed mask settled back into place. "Indeed. I had not realized our village detective was being consulted officially." "I am merely an observer," said Miss Marple mildly, "though I confess I am curious about one or two small matters. Your parasol, for instance. Such a lovely piece. Might I see it?" The request was so unexpected that Mrs. Stoutley hesitated fractionally before rising. "My parasol? I suppose so, though I cannot imagine why it would be of interest." She retrieved it from the stand in the hallway and handed it to Miss Marple, who accepted it with a murmur of appreciation. It was indeed beautiful. The shaft, covered in delicate lace over cream silk, the handle carved ivory worn smooth with use. Miss Marple turned it slowly in her hands, her fingers exploring with apparent casualness. "Such craftsmanship, and so well maintained. You must take great care of it." "It belonged to my mother," said Mrs. Stoutley, a note of warmth entering her voice for the first time. "I am naturally careful with such pieces." "Of course." Miss Marple had reached the ferrule, the metal tip that protected the end of the parasol. Her fingers paused there, feeling along the join where metal met wood. "Inspector, might I borrow Mr. Pratt's magnifying lens? I believe you have it with you." Slack produced the lens with poorly concealed curiosity, and Miss Marple examined the ferrule closely under its magnification. After a long moment, she looked up. "Mrs. Stoutley, there is a small nick here, just where the ferrule meets the shaft. And in the groove, if you observe carefully, there are traces of a gray glittery substance, rather like fine mica, or perhaps the silvering from the back of a mirror." The color drained from Mrs. Stoutley's face, though her voice remained steady. "I purchased some items at the church bric-a-brac sale last week, old mirrors among them. I must have brushed against one while examining the goods." "Quite possibly," agreed Miss Marple. She lifted the ferrule to her nose and sniffed delicately. "There is also a faint scent here, oil and something else. French polish, perhaps, the sort used on wooden frames and furniture." "Many items at the sale were polished wood. I'm sure that explains it." Miss Marple set the parasol aside and removed one of her own gloves, producing from her handbag a small hand lens of her own. "Might I examine your gloves, Mrs. Stoutley? The pale gray ones you wore yesterday evening?" "They are being laundered," said Mrs. Stoutley quickly. "Are they indeed? That seems rather prompt, given that you wore them only yesterday." "They could not have been so very soiled from a simple outing to the fair." "I am particular about cleanliness, Miss Marple," Surely that is not a crime. Not at all, my dear, though it does make one wonder what you were so anxious to clean away. Inspector Slack had been watching this exchange with growing interest. Now he spoke, his voice gruff. Mrs. Stoutley, I'm going to be direct with you. We have evidence that someone entered the service passage of Sears Pavilion during the ghost flicker. Someone who knew about the two-way mirror and the opening behind it. Someone who used that opening to strike Mr. Ashby with a narrow-pointed weapon. And you believe that weapon was my parasol? Mrs. Stoutley's voice was cold with disdain. How absurd. As you can see, it is perfectly intact on the outside. Yes, said Miss Marple. But parasol ferrules can be unscrewed, Mrs. Stoutley, and if one were to fit a thin blade inside the hollow shaft, removing it after use, the parasol would appear quite normal to casual inspection. She reached for the parasol again, her fingers finding the ferrule. With your permission, Inspector? Slack nodded, and Miss Marple attempted to twist the ferrule. It resisted at first, then turned smoothly. The metal cap came away, revealing the hollow end of the wooden shaft. It was empty, of course. Whatever had been there was long since removed. But the inside of the shaft showed scratches, fresh marks where metal had scraped against wood. Someone has recently inserted something into this shaft, said Miss Marple quietly. Something narrow and hard enough to score the wood, and when that something was removed, it left these marks. Mrs. Stoutley rose abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This is preposterous. You have no proof of anything. Scratches in a parasol shaft prove nothing. Perhaps not alone, agreed Miss Marple. But combined with the silvering on the ferrule, the oil and polish, the fact that you were seen near Mrs. Hatch's stall during the flicker, that your gloves have been hastily laundered, and that you asked Mr. Sayre very particular questions about the service passage only days before the murder. Circumstantial, said Mrs. Stoutley, but her voice had lost its certainty. There is also the matter of your alibi, continued Miss Marple relentlessly but gently. Multiple witnesses claimed they saw you in the long gallery during the ghost flicker, but they saw you holding your parasol in your left hand, did they not? Yet you habitually carry items in your right hand. A mirror reverses what we see, Mrs. Stoutley. Those witnesses saw your reflection while you stood in the service passage, not your actual position in the gallery. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Stoutley stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. He was destroying me, she said at last, her voice barely audible. Roland Ashby had discovered a document among my late husband's papers, a mortgage concealed as a charitable donation. Nothing criminal, you understand. But it would have appeared very bad. He threatened to expose it at the Improvement Society meeting unless I helped him force the fair off the green and secured him a commission for redevelopment. He was a blackmailer, pure and simple. So you arranged to meet him in the pavilion, said Miss Marple softly. He chose the location himself, she said. Said the mirrors would ensure privacy. He didn't realize I had already explored the pavilion, discovered the service passage. A bitter smile crossed her lips. I turned his own cleverness against him. Inspector Slack stood, his expression grim. Eleanor Stoutley, I am arresting you for the murder of Roland Ashby. As the widow was led away, Miss Marple carefully reassembled the parasol and set it aside. Such a delicate thing, really, to have become an instrument of death. But then, she reflected, the most dangerous weapons often were. Chapter 8. A draft at a dead end. The arrest of Mrs. Eleanor Stoutley sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that would be felt for months to come. Yet for all the confession wrung from her in that drawing room, Inspector Slack found himself facing a significant problem when he returned to his office that evening. "It's not enough," he admitted to Miss Marple, who had accompanied him back to the station. "A confession obtained under pressure without caution won't hold up in court. Her solicitor will have it thrown out before we can say Jack Robinson." "I need physical evidence, Miss Marple. Something concrete that places her in that service passage with a weapon in her hand." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Then I believe we must return to the pavilion once more, Inspector. There are still details we have not fully explored." They arrived at the fair as dusk was falling, the painted wagon casting long shadows across the green. Mr. Sayre met them at the entrance, his expression weary but cooperative. "Inspector Slack says you need to examine the service passage again," he said. "I'll light the lamps for you." With Tom Liddon's help, they soon had sufficient illumination in the narrow corridor behind the mirrors. Miss Marple moved slowly along its length, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When she reached the section corresponding to the alcove where Ashby had died, she stopped. "Mr. Liddon, would you be so kind as to open that panel again, the one with the felt button?" Tom pressed the concealed catch, and the slit opened with its soft click. Cool air immediately wafted through from the maze beyond, causing the lamp flame to flicker. "You see, Inspector, there is a distinct draft here. The air flows from the maze into the service passage, which tells us that the passage is slightly cooler, more enclosed. Someone standing here in the dark would feel that draft quite clearly." She knelt down, her joints protesting, and examined the narrow sill behind the opening. "And here, if you would direct your light just so, you can see marks in the dust." The torch beam revealed what she indicated. A clear impression in the accumulated dust of the sill, as though something had rested there temporarily, and beside it, a small dark smear that Dr. Haydock had identified as blood. "But what interests me most," continued Miss Marple, "is this." She pointed to a small tuft of black velvet caught on a splinter of wood near the edge of the opening. Using her handkerchief, she carefully removed it and held it up to the light. "This velvet matches the backing of the mirrors, but it also matches something else, the black velvet lining that is often sewn inside the hollow shafts of quality parasols." Tom Liddon spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Miss Marple, there's something I should tell you, something I saw but didn't understand at the time." "Yes, Tom?" "When I was working on that wire just before the ghost flicker started, I heard the service door open and close. I thought it was Mr. Sayre checking something, so I didn't think much of it. But then, during the flicker itself, I heard footsteps in the passage. Quick, light footsteps, a woman's footsteps." "Why didn't you mention this before?" demanded Slack. Tom's face reddened. "Because I was afraid it might have been Poppy, sir. I thought maybe she'd slipped back here for some reason, and I didn't want to get her in trouble." "But it couldn't have been Poppy. She was counting the cash box where everyone could see her." "Did you see who it was?" asked Miss Marple gently. "No, ma'am. It was too dark, and I was around the corner. But I heard them moving quickly along the passage, and then there was a sort of soft sound, like fabric brushing against wood, and then nothing for maybe 30 seconds, and then the footsteps again, going back toward the service door." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That fabric sound would have been Mrs. Stoutley's dress brushing the narrow walls as she positioned herself at this opening, and the 30 seconds of silence would have been while she waited for Mr. Ashby to turn his back, presenting the perfect target. She turned her attention back to the wooden sill. "Inspector, if you would photograph this area carefully before we disturb it further. The blood smear, the dust impression, and particularly this tuft of velvet. I believe when we examine Mrs. Stoutley's parasol more thoroughly, We will find that its internal velvet lining has a small tear corresponding to where this tuft was caught. She'll have disposed of the blade by now, said Slack gloomily. Thrown it in a river or buried it somewhere. Perhaps. But the parasol itself cannot easily be disposed of without raising questions. It was her mother's, she said. A treasured possession. And treasured possessions leave traces, Inspector. Scratches in the shaft where the blade was inserted, residue from the oils used to keep the blade from rusting, and most tellingly, the modifications made to the ferrule to accommodate a removable cap that could conceal a weapon. She moved to examine the floor of the service passage near the door. And here, I think we have one final piece of evidence. In the dust near the entrance, partially obscured but still visible, was the clear impression of a shoe, a woman's shoe, narrow and elegant, with a distinctive pattern on the sole. Mrs. Stoutley was wearing gray kid shoes yesterday evening, said Miss Marple. They had a particular crosshatch pattern on the sole. I noticed them when she nearly stumbled on the grass near the pavilion entrance. If you compare this print with her shoes, I believe you will find they match. Slack was already sketching the print in his notebook, his earlier gloom lifting. Right. We photograph everything here, take a cast of that footprint, and get a warrant to search Mrs. Stoutley's house thoroughly. If there's any trace of that blade or any evidence she modified the parasol, we'll find it. Tom Liddon cleared his throat. Inspector, sir, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner about the footsteps. I should have realized it was important. You've told us now, lad, and that's what matters. Your testimony about hearing someone in this passage during the ghost flicker, combined with the physical evidence, should be enough to make the case solid. As they emerged from the pavilion into the evening air, Miss Marple paused to look back at the painted wagon with its promise of mirrors and ghosts. Optical illusions, she said softly. That's what Mr. Sir advertised, and Mrs. Stoutley used them brilliantly. She created an alibi from reflections, made people see her where she was not, while she committed murder from behind a looking-glass. It was clever, I must admit, but cleverness without wisdom is a dangerous thing. She'll hang for it, said Slack bluntly. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression was grave. Another life destroyed by pride and desperation. Another soul lost to the darkness that sometimes lurked beneath respectability's surface. It was, she reflected, a lesson saint. Mary Mead would not soon forget. The fair would leave in a few days, taking its mirrors and illusions elsewhere. But the memory of what had happened here, of how a parasol and a two-way mirror had become instruments of death, would remain long after the painted wagon was gone. Chapter 9. A Toffee Wrapper and a Time. The warrant was executed the following morning, and what Inspector Slack's men found in Mrs. Stoutley's cellar workshop confirmed much of what Miss Marple had theorized. A small vise still held traces of metal filings. A pot of whale oil sat beside a tin of French polish, and wrapped in oilcloth at the back of a cupboard was a slim stiletto blade, its point stained dark despite obvious attempts at cleaning. Yet it was not these discoveries that occupied Missy Marple's thoughts as she sat with Lady Bantry that afternoon. Instead, she found herself considering the matter of Mrs. Hatch's testimony, which had troubled her from the beginning. You see, Dolly, she explained, Mrs. Stoutley claimed she purchased toffees during the ghost flicker. Mrs. Hatch confirmed this, but the timing has been bothering me. Why? Asked Lady Bantry, pouring tea. Surely if Mrs. Hatch says she sold her the toffees, that's evidence she was at the stall and not in the service passage. Ah, but Mrs. Hatch said she sold the toffees during the flicker, which lasted only 30 seconds. Yet Tom Liddon heard footsteps in the service passage during that same period. Both things cannot be true simultaneously. Unless Mrs. Stoutley bought the toffees after committing the murder. Precisely, which would make her purchase not an alibi, but an attempt to establish one after the fact. And more importantly, it would give her a reason to have been near the service door. Miss Marple had requested that Mrs. Hatch bring the rubbish bin from her stall to the police station, much to that good woman's bewilderment. Now, with Inspector Slack looking on skeptically, she donned a pair of cotton gloves and began to sort through its contents. "Looking for buried treasure, Miss Marple?" asked Slack with heavy humor. "Looking for a toffee wrapper, Inspector. And here, I believe we have it." She extracted a sticky paper wrapper, handling it with care. Even in the dim light of Slack's office, something was visible clinging to its surface. "Velvet fibers," she said, peering at them closely. Black velvet fibers stuck to the adhesive surface of the wrapper. And if I'm not mistaken, there's also a faint smear of something oily, the same French polish scent we found on Mrs. Stoutley's parasol ferrule. Slack leaned forward, interested. Now, how would toffee paper get velvet and polish on it? By being handled immediately after someone had been in contact with both substances. Mrs. Stoutley emerged from the service passage, having just committed murder with a weapon wrapped in velvet and coated with preservative oils. Her gloves would have carried traces of both. When she purchased the toffees from Mrs. Hatch and handled the wrapper, those traces transferred. "But Mrs. Hatch said she bought them during the flicker," protested Slack. "Mrs. Hatch is an honest woman, but she was mistaken about the timing. The fair was crowded. The lights were dim and changing constantly. The ghost flicker ended at 9:10 and 15 seconds, according to Mr. Sears' timing mechanism. I believe Mrs. Stoutley arrived at the stall at 9:10 and 30 seconds, perhaps 45 seconds, only moments after the flicker ended, but technically after it." Lady Bantry, who had accompanied them out of sheer curiosity, nodded slowly. Mrs. Hatch would naturally assume it was during the flicker if it was so close to it, and in all the excitement, who would notice a difference of 30 seconds exactly? Mrs. Stoutley laid her parasol flat on the counter, Mrs. Hatch told us, which was unusual. I believe she did so because she needed both hands free to quickly unscrew the ferrule and remove the blade before purchasing the toffees. The purchase itself was calculated. It gave her a reason to have been near the service door. It provided an apparent alibi for the crucial time, and the act of eating toffee would mask any unusual breathing or agitation. Miss Marple carefully placed the wrapper in an evidence envelope. And of course, she chose toffee specifically because it's sweet and sticky. One does not eat toffee and then immediately speak to people at close quarters. It gave her an excuse to keep her distance from other fairgoers while she composed herself. Slack was making notes rapidly. Right. So the timeline is 9:10 exactly. Ghost flicker begins. Mrs. Stoutley is already in the service passage, having entered through the exterior door while people were distracted by the crowds. During the flicker, she opens the panel, strikes Ashby, closes it again. 9:10 and 15 seconds. Flicker ends. She exits the service passage and within seconds is at Mrs. Hatch's stall, purchasing toffees and establishing what she thinks is an alibi and creating evidence against herself in the process, added Miss Marple. The wrapper, you see, provides proof that she handled something contaminated with velvet and oil immediately before purchasing the toffees. Combined with Tom's testimony about the footsteps, the physical evidence in the service passage, and the modified parasol, it places her at the scene at the crucial moment. She was so careful about everything else, mused Lady Bantry. The mirrors, the timing, the weapon, but she didn't think about something as simple as a toffee wrapper. Pride, my dear Dolly. She was so confident in her clever plan with the mirrors and reflections that she overlooked the mundane details. She thought purchasing toffees made her alibi stronger, when in fact it provided us with evidence of her guilt. Inspector Slack stood, gathering his papers. Well, that's another nail in her coffin, so to speak. Between the blade, the parasol modifications, the footprint, Tom's testimony, and now this wrapper, we have her dead to rights. As they emerged from the police station into the afternoon sunlight, Miss Marple paused to observe the green, where Sears' Wonder Pavilion was being dismantled. The painted panels were coming down, the mirrors being carefully wrapped and loaded onto wagons. By tomorrow, there would be no trace that the fair had ever been there. "It's rather sad," said Lady Bantry. "The Sears will suffer for this, though they did nothing wrong. They will move on to another town, another green," said Miss Marple. "Such is the life of traveling shows, but they will carry this story with them, I think. The murder in the House of Mirrors. It will become part of the lore of the fair, told and retold until fact and legend blur together. And Mrs. Stoutley? Mrs. Stoutley will face justice. She killed a man, Dolly. However much he may have deserved her hatred, one cannot take the law into one's own hands, no matter how justified one feels. That way lies chaos." They walked slowly back toward Miss Marple's cottage, the evening air soft around them. Behind them, the green was returning to its ordinary self, the extraordinary events of the past days already beginning to fade into village memory. But Miss Marple would not forget. She never did. Each case, each tragedy added to her understanding of human nature in all its complexity, the capacity for both great good and terrible evil that resided in even the most respectable hearts. "Come, Dolly," she said, linking her arm through her friend's. "Let us have a quiet cup of tea and speak of pleasant things. We've had quite enough of mirrors and murder for 1 week." And Lady Bantry, who understood her friend very well indeed, agreed wholeheartedly. Chapter 10. House of Mirrors, Angles, Slits, and the Lady Who Was Seen But Wasn't. 3 days after the arrest, Inspector Slack requested that all parties involved gather at Sears' Wonder Pavilion for a final review of the case. The pavilion had been reprieved from dismantling temporarily, serving now as an unlikely courtroom where the truth would be laid bare under bright electric lights, rather than the mysterious blue glow of the ghost flicker. They assembled among the mirrors at 4 o'clock. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack, Mr. Gideon Sir with his daughter Poppy, and Tom Liddon, Agnes Reed, Mrs. Hatch, and several constables who had worked on the investigation. Mrs. Stoutley herself was absent, confined to a cell 20 miles away, but her presence haunted the gathering nonetheless. Miss Marple stood near the alcove where Roland Ashby had died, her slight figure commanding attention despite her unassuming manner. Inspector Slack had requested that she explain the case in full, and she had agreed, though not without private reservations about the theatricality of the exercise. The method, she began without preamble, was both simple and ingenious. During the ghost flicker, when the lights dimmed to blue and the two-way mirrors revealed their hidden properties, Mrs. Stoutley used the optical confusion to create an alibi from reflections. She gestured toward the long gallery visible from where they stood. Several witnesses reported seeing Mrs. Stoutley in that corridor during the critical 30 seconds, holding her parasol in her left hand. But Mrs. Stoutley habitually carries items in her right hand. What they actually saw was her reflection in the mirrors, reversed as all reflections are. She stood not in the gallery, but in the service passage behind these mirrors, visible to observers through the two-way glass. Tom Liddon nodded slowly. That's why people were so certain about where they'd seen her. They had seen her, just not where they thought. Precisely. Meanwhile, Mr. Ashby waited in this alcove, believing he had arranged a private meeting in the maze's confusion. Mrs. Stoutley had positioned herself in the service passage directly behind this spot. Miss Marple moved to indicate the mirror panel. Using a concealed catch, she opened a small panel here, waited for the precise moment when Ashby's back was turned, and struck upward through the opening with a narrow blade. Dr. Haydock spoke up. The wound trajectory matches perfectly, with a thrust made from behind the mirror, upward between the ribs, striking the heart with lethal precision. The blade itself, continued Miss Marple, was concealed within the hollow shaft of her parasol. She had modified the ferrule to unscrew, allowing her to insert and remove the weapon as needed. This explains the scratches inside the shaft, the silver dust on the ferrule from brushing against the mirror backing, and the traces of whale oil and French polish used to preserve both the blade and the parasol's mechanisms. Inspector Slack took up the narrative. After committing the murder, Mrs. Stoutley closed the panel, exited the service passage through the exterior door beside Mrs. Hatch's stall, quickly removed the blade from her parasol while laying it flat on the counter, and purchased toffees to establish her presence there and mask any agitation. The toffee wrapper, added Miss Marple, carried velvet fibers and oil traces from her gloves, proving she had handled contaminated materials immediately before the purchase. The timing, though close to the ghost flicker, was actually after it, though Mrs. Hatch naturally conflated the two events. Poppy Sear's voice was small. But why did she do it? Mr. Ashby was unpleasant, certainly, but to kill him? Blackmail, said Miss Marple gently. Mr. Ashby had discovered something compromising about Mrs. Stoutley's late husband's financial affairs. Nothing criminal, but damaging to her reputation in the community where she had worked so hard to maintain her position. He threatened exposure unless she helped him drive your father's fare off the green and secured him a development commission. Rather than submit to his demands, she chose to eliminate him. She used our pavilion, said Mr. Sir bitterly, turned our honest entertainment into a stage for murder. She used the very features Ashby thought would protect him, Miss Marple corrected. The mirrors that confused perception, the darkness of the ghost flicker, the optical illusions that made people see what wasn't there. She was intelligent enough to understand that in a house of mirrors, reality becomes negotiable. People doubt their own eyes, she paused, her gaze moving across the assembled group. The clues were there from the beginning, the breath condensation on the wrong side of the glass, proving someone had stood in the service passage. The backwards exit sign that read correctly, revealing the two-way mirror's nature. The draft at what appeared to be a dead end, showing an opening, existed. The ticket count that didn't match the clicker, proving someone had used an alternate entrance. The silvering on her glove and ferrule, the blood and velvet in the service passage, the toffee wrapper with its telltale fibers. Each piece alone might mean little, but together they told an irrefutable story. And yet, said Lady Bantry, she nearly succeeded. If not for your attention to detail, Jane, she might have gotten away with it entirely. Perhaps, allowed Miss Marple, though I suspect her own pride would ultimately have betrayed her. She could not resist being clever, and cleverness often overreaches itself. The parasol modifications, the careful timing, the optical alibi, all were too elaborate. A simpler crime might have gone undetected, but Mrs. Stoutley wanted not merely to kill Ashby, but to demonstrate her superiority in doing so. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. The case against her is solid. The physical evidence, the testimony, the weapon, all of it. She'll stand trial at the assizes next month. A heavy silence followed this pronouncement. Miss Marple moved to the service passage entrance, now standing open in the daylight. She pressed the felt button that controlled the panel, watching. It slid open to reveal the alcove. Beyond, reflections are not presents, she said quietly, echoing. words she would later speak to Mrs. Stoutley herself. One should never borrow one's alibi from a looking-glass. They show truth, but they show it backwards. And that reversal, that distortion, was ultimately her undoing. She turned to face Mr. Sir. Your pavilion was merely the setting, Mr. Sear. The true mirrors were in Mrs. Stoutley's mind, reflecting her pride and desperation, until she could no longer distinguish right from wrong. The optical illusions you created for entertainment became, in her hands, instruments of murder. But the fault was hers, not yours. Mr. Sir nodded gratefully, and Miss Marple saw the tension ease slightly in Poppy's shoulders. As they emerged from the pavilion into the late afternoon sunlight, Lady Bantry linked arms with Miss Marple. Well, that's that then. Justice served and the mystery solved. Justice. Yes, agreed Miss Marple, though I cannot help but feel sorrow for all involved. Mrs. Stoutley destroyed herself as surely as she destroyed Ashby, and for what? To protect a reputation that would have weathered the scandal far better than it will weather a murder conviction. They walked across the green, leaving the pavilion behind. By tomorrow it would be gone, the mirrors packed. Away the painted wagon, rolling on to its next destination, St. Mary. Mead would return to its ordinary rhythms, though the memory of this week would linger. I shall take my mirrors and a powder compact from now on, declared Lady Bantry, sensibly small. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sensibly small, Dolly. Large ones invite angles, and angles, in my experience, invite trouble. Behind them, the late summer sun caught the remaining mirrors of the pavilion, sending fractured light across the green in a final, dazzling display. Truth and illusion, reality and reflection, all dancing together in the fading day. Miss Marple did not look back. She had seen quite enough of mirrors for one lifetime.